Welcome to another Enspiral podcast. I thought this time I'm just gonna chill comfortably in my hammock because Mark is a perfect person to talk to from a hammock, just in the super relaxed, chill vibe. Thank you for being here, Mark.
It is wonderful to be here. And I want to up front make sure I actually pronounce your name right. Is it Michał?
You
How do you
got
say
it
it?
perfectly. You got it perfectly. We practiced before
No,
in our
no, we
pre
didn't.
in our previous call.
Did we?
Yeah, but you got
Okay,
it
cool.
perfectly right. Perfectly right. Um, well, that's actually a good starting point because
Mm.
I remember still sending you an email after our call, and the kind of topic was all things alive. And this was one of the things that really stayed with me the most from our previous conversation, this notion that you brought of things living and non-living. And I was wondering if you'd like to give a little bit more context, and maybe this is a good exploration starting point for this conversation today.
Yeah, it's thank you. It's honestly, there's so many different ways I could take that, but maybe something that I said that triggered that would be nice to introduce is the simple idea and what I would claim fact, but maybe some people want to debate this, but the idea that a sustainable world is a living world. And so also a sustainable world is a living world, is a thriving world, is a joyful world, is a flourishing world. All of those things that we might think that we are trying to do or want for, um, it all essentially is the same thing. And so if that's true, then the simple logic goes that we kind of need to have some way of doing it. Like we need to know something about how to be in a living world in a sort of life supporting or alive way. And my senses were not particularly good at that as individuals and collectives and society or humanity. And so potentially, like that's our opportunity, is to figure out some of that. And yeah, my work would say that the pathway that provides is quite different to the pathway we're sort of currently on. And I don't know, that's pretty exciting for me. Yeah.
Mm, I wonder, what does it mean to be in a living world? And I'm curious specifically in this state of being. Like, what does it mean to be being in the living world?
Mm. The first thing that came to mind when you said that, which isn't really answering your question, but it's, I don't know. And this is I'm going to claim, at least when I say this isn't a judgmental comment, but I don't think we're really trying to be in the living world. Um, as again, as individuals and groups and so forth. I think that my sense is what we're trying to do instead is something else. It's perhaps about progress um, or maximizing some made up variable. Um, so in some ways, like the fact that that's a question, I think is really curious. We should know what it is if we're doing it. Or maybe another way to say that is maybe, I don't know, without sort of getting too complicated, but there's a big difference between knowing something theoretically and knowing something because you're doing it practically. And I think that second one is the thing I'm trying to point to. And perhaps that's essentially what the question is. So anyways, that point there was that it's curious that my sense is that we're not really trying to do that generally. When I say we, the, white privileged people in the world. But to sort of maybe actually try and answer the question, the first thing I would point to is to be in relationship with it. And to accept it, and to one way to say it would be for let's speak about Michał for a second. For you to be living, there's two things that need to be true. You need to be living, and your environment needs to be able to support that. And whatever you do is going to affect the environment, and if it affects the environment in a way that means that it's no longer in the range that you're able to live in, that would obviously be detrimental to your living. And so in some ways that's maybe the simplest way to put it, like tending to your own life and the ability of the environment to support your life. And by the way, what that means is because we are a product of all life that's come before us, and our environment is the culmination of all other life, it ultimately means that not only are we dependent on an environment that must be in a certain range for us to be living, but we're dependent on a living environment where we're, generally speaking, better off when there's as much of liveness in our environment as possible. But I feel like there's probably another question you could ask that'll like dig in a little more.
I'm curious, how do you see the difference between living and non-living world?
Well, you could have ended that question with world or entity, and I think maybe the answer would be a bit different, because I feel like a living, non-living world, what it made my mind go to is like, a plant or an animal here and then a rock. That might be something that many people's minds might go to. And then in some ways, like, we already know that one's living and one's not. But we could get precise about why that is. And I can certainly offer something there. And I should say, just in terms of context, like these types of questions is what my research is on. So I'm going to claim that the things I say are grounded in the academic literature and my assembling of them. So why I say that, and I think this is quite important, and this is a little tangent, but what I've been doing exclusively for the last year or so, mostly for the sort of last 3 years, and then sort of for the last decade and a half in a sort of a rambling, meandering way, is in many ways trying to get my sense of the answer to this question of how is a person to live in this world, and sort of participate in the emergence of the potential that we're afforded because we're living and have all of these capabilities, and to contrast that against like the path that we are on as a humanity, which we're sort of degenerating many of the things that are important in our environment for us to be living. So this very much is the focus of my work, and I feel like I've learned a number of really important things about it because that's my focus. And what's really interesting for me is there's very few people in academia, certainly, that are looking at this type of question in particular. And so I often find myself in situations where people don't believe what I say because they think they have a sense of what it means to be living, and that they can have these particular questions and go and answer them and think that they're integrating this idea of living. But as being someone who is sort of exclusively doing this, it becomes quite clear that there's quite a big gap in how most people are thinking about this. But to be a bit more concrete for a moment, a first, well, there's sort of 3 levels of answer to what it means to be. Well, it's not even what it means to be living, but to be living, to be participating or doing life. The first answer is kind of a circular answer in that we know it and we're doing it because we're already it. And we kind of don't really need to have words to explain it because we are it. And like, that's a good start. But unfortunately, again, trying to not get too technical on this, if we were simply a biological animal, we would stay doing that, and there'd be some rebalancing and so forth from time to time, but ultimately life would sort of continue on its trajectory. But we have this amazing privilege and therefore, or gift, and therefore responsibility of having very developed consciousness. And so we're able to imagine things in our heads that aren't living or aren't compatible with a living world. And then we go and do things in the world based on that fantasy or that imagination. And then we end up doing things that start to degenerate our environment, and then ultimately start to compromise our ability to live because we're dependent on our environment. So that sort of first level answer of like, we know what life is because we are it. It doesn't seem, because we have developed consciousness that influences what we do so much, it doesn't seem enough. And so therefore we sort of need to go another level deeper. And in my work, there are sort of 2 other levels deeper. But the first level is we can look at the world or a thing or ourselves in sort of my thinking, at least, 5 different perspectives. And those perspectives are: what are we oriented towards? How are we organized? What are our processes? What are our relationships? And then sort of, what is our physical form? What's our structure? And my claim to you and to anyone who cares is that if we're trying to understand anything at all, it's really important to look at it through at least these 5 perspectives. And why this matters is because when we do so, we see different things. So for instance, like if we look at it through that last one I said, structures, and we look at life, we'll say, oh, life is water and oxygen and carbon dioxide and a body and all of these types of things. And we can get very narrow and focused on physical form, but that will be missing at least 4 other ways to look at it, which is, let's just go up a level into relationships. Like, we know that a living entity doesn't exist by itself. And so, like, what are the things that it's sort of inextricably connected to? So I don't know, I'm thinking about a frog for some reason today. Like, you know, a frog's cruising around, and you know, it's in relationships with insects because it eats them, or it's in relationship with it gets a bit gray how we define things, but you might say it's in relationship with some water that it's swimming around in, or maybe there's some lily pads or something that that allows it to sit on when it doesn't want to be in the water. You can come up with a whole bunch of different relationships, and there's different qualities and so forth in those relationships. But you know, we might see something different there. Maybe the last one I'll sort of give an example to, but one level up again, like processes. If we look at a frog and we want to sort of think about it being living, we might say, oh, it's breathing, or it's growing, or it's moving its legs, or if it's still a tadpole, its little tail. It's metabolizing, it's doing all of these processes, and we might go, oh, well, life is process. And again, like, if we only looked at it through that lens, we would be missing the other four. And so to kind of wrap on that sort of 5 perspectives piece, when we think about life and look at life and are trying to understand life and ultimately have enough understanding to do it, to do life well as a human with developed consciousness, these 5 perspectives are helpful to hold. And importantly, when we look at something through each of those 5 perspectives, we need to see very specific things in each of those perspectives to say, yes, this is a living entity or a living world, and also perhaps be able to have some sense of what direction it's moving in because of the quality of those things that we're seeing. I can speak much longer about like the next level, but that may or may not be necessary, or it might be easier to like speak to specific, what I call requirements in each of these 5 perspectives as we go. An opportunity might come up in our conversation to be specific about some of those.
Wow. Yeah, I love how you're expressing that. What a like a way of revealing the multifaceted and just such a complex totality of life, which, yeah, surprise, surprise, quite a complex thing. And it's fascinating that there are still like certain perspectives that at least can give you some grounding in navigating this complexity. One thing that's kind of stuck with me from which we're sharing. So I'll take us back there a little bit, just following that thread. You mentioned that we are, as humans, capable to imagine things that are not compatible with the living world. So I'm curious. Well, one thing is, what makes a thing compatible or not compatible with the living world? And also, like, if you can give some examples of those kind of things.
Yeah, this gets into somewhat tricky territory, mostly because it's almost everything we're doing isn't compatible with the living world. So like, which one to choose? And again, not to like be dramatic or pessimistic or anything like that, but when we do start to look at most things that we're doing as humans, we see issues with compatibility with the living world. And we kind of know that because we're aware how much our climate is changing, and we're aware of how our oceans are changing in temperature and acidity and all of these things. So we do know that we are living incompatibly with the living world. But yeah, so to complete that thought, like, I think there's very little that we are doing that is compatible. And for me, that's the opportunity, especially if we can be honest about that. Because once we are, it starts to afford us the ability to do things that prior to being aware of it or accepting it aren't possible for us. There's two other things that come up as you asked that, and I'm just going to talk around your question, and maybe not specifically to it, but yeah, one was sort of like a headline statement. When I look at the world that the human-made world, through these 5 perspectives, and with it turns out there's 16 requirements that this sort of framework includes. When I look at the human-made world through it, first of all, I see that it is unsustainable, or to use this language of living, we're living. There's no question we're living like that. We shouldn't have to debate that because we know that's true. But like, we're living in a way that is in a degenerative path for life, and therefore for life, the life of us as humans. So we're living unsustainably. But when I look at the human-made world through these 5 perspectives, it leads me to a second observation, or maybe even conclusion, which is it's really unlikely that we're going to change our human-made world into a sustainable world, because the task is so, gargantuan. It's such a massive task to change the human-made world in each, again, you don't do it, I'm going to change the orientation, and then I'm going to change the structure, or I'm going to change the process, and then I'm going to, like, all of these things change together. And they just so happen that structures are big things, that they're physical and tangible. And so to change a city from a sort of a degenerative city to a regenerative city, like, that's a big task, and it's physical. It requires physical changes in how our buildings and our roads and our infrastructure and all the rest of it. So that's one thing. But then if we sort of jump up to the least tangible part of this, the orientation, like, you can imagine, at least, again, in our heads, we can imagine this happening, which doesn't mean to say that it can. But at the moment, we're not oriented collectively as humans to living in relationship with all of nature. We're being driven and guided by other priorities. But, you can go, well, today we're driven by optimization of economic metrics, and tomorrow we're going to be oriented towards being part of a living world. Like, it's really easy to say that and go, oh, well, I'm just going to change that to that. There's nothing tangible that necessarily has to happen in the external world, but the psychological journey, the internal psychological consciousness journey for someone to go from whatever they're oriented at the moment to being oriented to a living world, maybe that's actually a harder task than changing a city from an unsustainable city to a sustainable city. But again, this kind of like, just it's not true to keep these things as separate things, but it's just helpful to look at it in different ways, because we see a different piece of it, or a different facet of it when we do. So that's kind of like the headline answer is everything. And the other thing that came up is, and I forget the question exactly how you framed it, but we could look at an organization. We could look at an organization like Enspiral, or maybe there's some better examples, and ask sort of one or two questions. One is, does it have the features that mean that it kind of has a foundation of life or living, or does it not? And if it doesn't, like, what might we want to do about it? And maybe I'd say that last sentence slightly differently. What might we need to do about it? Because I think something that is, I know we could get like really semantic with words, but the word want is very much like that whole idea of wanting something, as we think about it today as humans, is mostly like a consciousness. It's a product of our consciousness. We can imagine something and we have some sort of like positive emotional reaction to it, and therefore we want it. And so because we want it, we're going to try and get it. But in many ways, when we're talking about life and living, the word need is much more relevant, because it's not something that is so singularly psychologically driven, but it's more the whole human, that biologically there are things that we need to be able to access from our environment to support us living, and our environment needs us to be doing things with respect to it or in it that support it to be a living environment for us and for other species as well. So like the word need is maybe how I'd like to rephrase that last sentence I said, which is what we might need to be doing.
One thing that strikes me from kind of the beginning of this conversation is, on the one hand, it seems like quite I mean, I don't know, the word sad is the right choice of vocabulary. It's like, damn, where nothing that we do seems to be in alignment with the living world. That doesn't sound great. On the other hand, you seem to be like very relaxed about it and quite chilled. And even you, in the beginning, you were mentioning like we have those two paths, and this is, you see that as an exciting thing. So I'd be curious to hear more about, like where this, coming from your perspective with this awareness and seeing that, with the 5 perspective, the 16 requirements, what we do just like doesn't match. Um, how do you stay with this optimism and good vibe while
Mm,
studying deeply this reality?
mm. I think there's 3 things that come up here. Firstly, and again, like I don't want to be like the Debbie Downer, but if we're really honest about it, there are lots and lots of people that are suffering immensely in a whole myriad of different ways in our current society. And so that was people. And then I think all other species, or many other species, whether we take the bees or the cattle or the fish, like so many species, and let's just include humans as a species in this sentence, like so many species are suffering so deeply in the world at the moment. And again, I'm not trying to be negative, I'm sort of trying to be honest and aware. And so if we start with that as an idea, there's ubiquitous suffering in the world by all species, most species. And then we go, well, what's a different path? What might a different path feel like or be like? And my sense is like a realignment to participating in the world in a way that is supporting more life or flourishing. Like that's pretty appealing, to be giving my energy and attention to doing that. And this is, I think, I'm not sure if this will communicate, but I think this is really the crux of the shift or the transition that, the psychological transition I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but in a slightly different context. My sense is when we, as humans and groups of humans, start participating in emerging, let's use the word community, because I think that kind of captures it, like emerging communities that are actually compatible with life at a foundational level. And you can imagine, like, just imagine, I don't know, if you were a scuba diver, and I don't even know why I'm using this example because I'm not, but it's the one that comes to mind. Like, imagine being in the water and like seeing just all of this life and flourishing and like symbiosis and that type of thing, and just like, like coming from nothing and just getting more and more complex and vibrant and so forth. I think that's what participating or reconnecting or participating again in life with all of the potential that it holds. I think that's what the experience of doing that is. It's really generative. There's lots of things happening, like you're talking about before, in terms of being out in your backyard and wanting to like do sort of permaculture informed things, but like not having a clue maybe what to do. Like, this is it's a much more generative experience of life to be moving in this direction. And I think that is ultimately the thing that gives me energy and excitement and good vibes and so forth about it. So that's sort of like the second piece to what I want to say. And then the third piece, sort of just getting back to grounded reality for a second. The current human-made world doesn't make it easy for people to be participating in generating life, living in relationship with life, living compatibly with life, emerging a sustainable community. So there is this thing that does need to be worked with, again, both practically and psychologically, in this journey. And I've kind of in some ways like presented a sandwich where like the meat in the middle is all of this generation and vibrancy and flourishing and learning and all of that, and relationships with yourself and with other people and with your natural environment. But like, the top layer of bread, let's call it like white bread, is like a world of suffering. And maybe the other layer of bread in this sandwich is, well, actually, there are challenges, there are constraints at the moment to really bring this about. Yeah.
I'm just visualizing this.
I'm not sure if it's the right analogy or metaphor. It could easily fall over, but that's what came to mind.
I love it. And yeah, like to build upon what you were sharing about my experience, I just started recently to learn about the forest where I live. And basically, my experience was okay, I am very much aware that I'm a part of this ecosystem around me. And I have no clue about how it really functions. Like, sure, I have some informations and the basics, but really I have no clue. And I know that I have no clue, which is kind of like, whoa. And I guess there is something also maybe about this human experience of some kind of human, I don't know if pride is the right word, but it's kind of like sense of, I'm smart, I'm resourceful. There's AI, I can ask it questions and it's gonna tell me, the answer. But then I'm just looking at this life around me and just really being in sense of stillness and observing yeah, the birds and the bees and flowers and what kind of plants give flowers, and then what happens if there's sun, what if, and it just feels so overwhelming. So even from the point of view of a person who is really immersed in this magical place with the best intentions of like, hey, I want to nourish this place and I want to give it all my energy to cultivate more life, it still feels overwhelming just as a, I mean, I accept that I am a part of the ecosystem here, whether, I want it or I care or not. Like, I'm there, I'm here, I create some kind of impact, and I am in relation with all the beings around me. But yeah, it is a fascinating yeah, sandwich, as you say. And also there are those constraints, right? Like, this is what we were sharing in the what I was sharing with you before we
Mm,
started recording, that hey, I still spend so much time on my computer because that's my work, while being in this paradise place, and it feels just strange. It's not even good or bad, it's just kind of it makes me
yeah.
wonder.
And I'm glad that it does. I really love it. You just talked about, it's not good or bad. And I agree, it's not good or bad. Like, I think in a previous phase of my exploration, I would have described it as one or the other. And you know, to not sugarcoat, I would have described it as bad. And the reason for that is because it's degenerative. Um, But now I would agree with your comment that it's not good or bad. Um, and it matters because what we are doing leads in a particular direction. And if we're doing one thing, it leads to one place. And if we're doing a different thing, it leads to another place. And tying what we're doing with where it's heading is, I think, a really important piece of this puzzle. So, if we want to be really extreme and dramatic so that we're not necessarily talking about ourselves, because that might be too hard, take the person that never goes outside, spends all of their life interacting with the world through technology. Like, that leads in a particular direction, all of the infrastructure, the other people that have to be doing things to support this way of that person being, it's all essentially taking from the natural world to support that. And it has a natural conclusion in which at some point all of the world is technology and it's no longer living. And then we'll have this epiphany, oh, wow, actually, we needed that and now we don't have it. And so therefore we end. So like that leads somewhere in particular. However, if you take the complete other end of the spectrum where we have no electronic technology and we're only existing, we don't even maybe have much more than a shelter, like that leads in another direction, potentially where, and I'm just thinking this off the top of my head here, like there's absolutely an abundance of life and so forth. But it may be that that world doesn't really have that much of a contribution from humans in it because, I don't know, it's maybe too simple a way of living. And so somewhere in between these two extremes is a sweet spot where as humans, and all of the evolution of our cognitive and consciousness capabilities, where we are able to harness those and apply them or be in the world from those strengths, but do so in a way that also supports the life supporting capacity of the planet so that it continues to support us. That sweet spot, I think, is, there is this Goldilocks zone of not too hot, not too cold that to me, we're being pointed to. So that's, I don't know how exactly I got there, but a couple of other things that, to get a bit more concrete on your specific example, like you as a human, and any living entity for that matter, you eat, you metabolize. So that is something that is a hard constraint for all living entities. That does have to happen. And for most, you're going to get that from your environment somehow. And so therefore, if you just take, Michał and your environment, then, you need to get your metabolism requirements from your environment. So therefore, they need to be in your environment and be able to be producing them so that you're able to consume them. And if you're able to do that and you're a healthy, thriving entity, you're going to be able to make contributions into that environment that you as a human are uniquely able to do. And that could be with your hands and so forth, but it could also be with your mind, that you've figured something out that sort of doesn't naturally occur biologically, that then can influence your actions and bring about more life. And that would be true if your understanding of how to be a living entity in your head was sufficient and up to the task. And I would say in general, that's not where we're at yet. So that is, I think, maybe part of our movement here is understanding life in our consciousness sufficiently that the contributions we make to the environment are actually, like transcendent. They're beyond what we're currently doing, but they're doing it in a way that's compatible with all of life. There was one other thought there, but it's just left my mind, and so I'll let it do that.
It's okay. Maybe it will come back.
Maybe.
Wow. When you were sharing about the sweet spot in between those two extreme possible paths, it made me think of Ishmael, which is a book that
Yeah, I love
really
the book.
touched me,
Yeah.
and it kind of seemed to end with a very similar conclusion, that we have this very unique role that we could play, which is very encouraging, that we could decide to kind of destroy the planet in a way, but we don't have to. And just having this awareness and making an alternative choice, it's such a privilege and honor and something, yeah, really just special to fulfill as a role in this whole ecosystem of species living on this planet. Um, and I remember it was always very like heart touching, this point that, yeah, this precisely because we have this alternative paths available to us. Yeah, that's points out at the importance of this role.
Yeah, and I think this is a nice entry point to, in many ways, like we've been talking about life and living systems and flourishing of humans and other species and so forth up until this point. And you might logically conclude that that's the thing that I'm most interested in, which is, yeah, the flourishing of life and participating with our awareness of what our reality is and what potential we can create with our capabilities and doing so. And kind of, you could maybe think that I think that pathway is good and then the pathway we're on is bad. But I'm going to make a case based on what you just said that that what I'm most interested in doing is helping us be more honest about what we are doing, with a general belief that or sense, I kind of don't like that word belief, but that's another conversation, that by having a better grip on this reality, it is part of our journey to in a different direction. And so what I specifically want to make a case for here is and if we, again, this is trying to tell as accurate a story as we can, but also because it's helpful. So I would like to make the case that everything that we've done as humans and everything that we are capable of doing in this moment, no question it's caused a whole bunch of suffering. But I think we can tell a story that it's actually a really important part of our developmental journey as a species and contribution to the natural living world, because we've developed all these technologies that essentially has sort of networked us around the world in terms of, in some ways, like networking our brains and so forth. And we're potentially, because of that, able to move to a collective awareness of what our relationship with the living world actually is, that can then support a transition of how we relate to it and how we are in it, that may never have been afforded without the technologies that we've developed. So it's really it's a real sort of paradox, or almost like really intense tension between seeing all of the destruction that comes with the development of technology, but at the same time understanding like what it can potentially unlock. And so like, if we stay on this linear pathway that technology seems to kind of be on, then no question we know where that logically concludes. However, and this is maybe my optimism, my naive optimism coming through here, because I can imagine it, if we're able to really listen and hear what these technologies are sort of enabling us to hear and to see and so forth, and that actually changes who we are internally as individuals and then as collectives, yeah, I could tell quite a good story that this is part of our developmental journey to what comes next. And we will only know what we do. So like, if it does influence that and we then respond appropriately with this awareness, that is the journey to a sustainable world, to a flourishing world, to a world with very little suffering, etc., where all life is abundant. Like we can't have both. We can't have one without the other. We that awareness that is emergent changes us, and we change onto a pathway to a sustainable world, or it doesn't change us and we sort of maybe stay on the path that we're on, or maybe a path which is in the same direction but just at a slightly slower rate. So like, these things are inextricably tied together. Yeah, I don't know. In some ways, I'm expressing gratitude for technology, and at the same time pointing out or inviting maybe myself, but also as many other people as possible, to really appreciate it in its entirety, that it's affording us a capability of awareness, which is amazing. And it's suggesting that we need to be moving into a different relationship with technology, a sweet spot that we're not at yet. And if we're able to do that, that is part of the pathway to a sustainable world. And if we aren't able to do that, then we end up somewhere else.
That feels to me like a very good point to end this conversation. I really like this possibilities that you unfolded for us, and yeah, just this awareness that we're still on the journey, right? Nothing is concluded, and it's all a process. And who knows, in 100 years, whatever the suffering and obstacles and destruction that is happening. Maybe it's just actually the part of the most amazing story that just needed to have the conflict and the tension and all the difficulties for the character to be built.
Mm. Mm. That sounds nice.
Sounds nice. Well, let's see. Thank you so much, Mark. This was such a beautiful, beautiful experience to hear how you, yeah, how you communicate your studies and research and all the wisdom that you're interacting with. And yeah, thank you so much for synthesizing it all and doing all the work. I'm really grateful.
Likewise, the things I'd be grateful for is your interest and curiosity, but also I could really feel your presence in that, just how you what you just did in terms of wrapping us up, that the self-awareness of yourself and this moment and me to know, hey, yeah, this feels good, we're complete. So gratitude for you for all of those things that you brought.
Thank you so much.